Hello, everyone. Today, we're gonna be talking about the history of Ukraine. Yes, it's a country out into Eastern Europe, next to Poland and Russia and Belarus, I should say, and Moldova, and I believe even Romania is bordering Ukraine. But anyway, we're gonna be talking about the history of Ukraine. So, during World War One, we're going to start in World War One because I don't really know any history besides World War One because world history normally starts at World War One for some reason. Ukraine was split up into between two or three different countries. Ukrainians were split up into two or three different countries. Poland, I think there's a little chunk of Ukraine, not even really a big chunk. Poland was a little bit bigger back then. Poland, Austria-Hungary, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Russian Empire. And then, what happened was of course, Austria-Hungary collapsed after World War One, so parts of Ukraine got independent, but, of course, they were taken over by the Russian Empire that turned into Soviet Russia, and then Soviet Russia in 1922 split up into four different countries, sort of. Ukraine was technically represented as a separate country when they signed the Constitution. So while they were under the control of Russia, Moscow, I should say, not Russia, Moscow, they were separate republic in the Soviet times, in 1922. But before 1922, they were part of Soviet Russia, so it's a little confusing. Anyway, for those 60 years, they had the same territory except for, well, of course, we used to talk about World War II, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. We're going to talk about what the territory was during the Soviet times, before and a little bit after World War II. So, it's basically the current-day borders of Ukraine, except for Crimea, which was a little island area. They had these ethnic people called Crimeans, or Khmer, I forgot how to pronounce the island. I forgot. It's an island, right? Or a peninsula, I should say. Khmer. Khmer is a Crimea. That's right. Crimea is a peninsula that has an ethnic group, and they also had a lot of Russian speakers. And what happened was, I believe it was in the 1970s or 80s, it got transferred to, instead of the Russian Federal Soviet Republic, it got transferred to the Ukrainian Soviet Republic. Problem is, it added a lot more Russian speakers into their country. But we won't address that right now. But that was basically the current territory when it was during the Soviet Union around the 1970s. But before that, there was a war, World War II, obviously. So while in 1922 they were a separate republic, and the borders may have been slightly different, I don't remember. But Germany wanted to enslave all the Slavs, or kill all the Slavs, I should say, and make a German heartland. During World War II, they had the Nazi Party, right? National Socialism, which is absolutely terrible. Probably worse than Soviet Socialism in some ways, because it only had one group above everybody else. The Soviets killed 6 million people, or I think about 5 to 6 million people before the Germans ever showed up to Ukraine, right? And when the Germans showed up, guess what they immediately did? They could have made allies with the Ukrainians. Now, some of the Ukrainians did fight for the Nazis. Don't get me wrong. There were some Nazi Ukrainians, but right, as soon as the Germans started showing up, they started massacring people because they didn't know the difference between German and Ukrainian, probably, or maybe they did, but they didn't care. They were Slavic. They weren't German, so they wanted to kill them, right? It was the Germans saw themselves as a separate group of people compared to the Ukrainians, right? Ukrainians have always been with other groups of people, but the Germans have, for some reason, they thought that their group of people was superior to everybody else, so they wanted to nationalize everything into German, or make everybody German. You had to share the same blood or whatever. It was really dumb. But anyway, that's besides the point, right? Germany went in, started killing a few 100,000 of them, maybe even millions, I don't even know. And then the Soviets took it back. Again, and so there was another thing that happened. Before the Germans took over, there was the Soviets, obviously, and Lenin and both Joseph Stalin did this. there were these private farmers in Ukraine, and they wanted to make a profit. And the private farms that were owned by little families were, selling goods, and they were giving people what they wanted, the market what they wanted. But of course, so the Soviets weren't going to allow that to happen, so they decided to kill them all. Get rid of all hierarchy that has any profit incentive, and also overinflate their currency. They did the same thing that the Germans did in Germany during World War II. They're both socialists, but one's a right-wing socialism, one's left-wing socialism. Again, I haven't gone into details on that. I did make a separate video a little bit on that topic. I will make a new video on between right-wing socialism and left-wing socialism, but it doesn't matter, right? The left-wing socialists basically took over, the Soviets, I should say, took over and killed anything that had a profit incentive. And they also overinflated the currency, so there would be no way for your currency to be even any value whatsoever to you. They wanted everybody to go to the Soviets for help, all the planning was done through the Soviets. If you're a farmer, you had to listen to what the Soviets told you what to do, not what your family wanted to do, and sell the goods. So they killed anybody who was selling goods for a profit. Even if you were a small little farmer and you just got your land, they killed them all. The kulaks, the Ukrainian kulaks was what they're called. Private little farms, all nationalized and killed off, for the most part. There was, actually, during the Soviet times, after World War II, there was about 5% of the farms were private in Ukraine. And they were producing around 30 to 50% of the food. Obviously, the Soviets didn't have a lot of data on it because they didn't want to prove that the private farms are actually working. But it turns out profit is way more better than force. But we won't talk about that. That is another argument of why the profit incentive is always going to be better than force. There's only been two ways to encourage economic growth: force or profit. We could try to do sex, but it's not going to work out. I've never seen an economy run on sex entirely. Anyway, that's besides the point. So, the Germans, and again, we had a bunch of Ukrainian units that were Nazis, but there was the 2nd Battalion that were Nazis, right? Or they worked for the SSS, the SS group, right? However, as soon as the Nazis knew that they were losing, as soon as they thought that the Nazis were going to lose, they went back to the Soviet. They went back with the Allied units. They actually went to the western border where the Germans were fighting in, like, France, and they actually got deported to Canada because they knew they were going to die if the Soviets found them, or the Germans, because they were against both, again, left-wing and right-wing socialism. This group of semi-Nazis, they fought against the Soviets because, again, their people were dying in the Soviet Union, but as soon as they realized the Nazis were bad, they started fighting the Nazis too. So they were actually one of the few only military groups that fought the Nazis and actually got a full pardon because they didn't actually commit any war crimes. They just hated everybody because, again, everybody that wanted to invade them wanted to kill them. So you could kind of see why there are Nazi, and again, a lot of units are inspired off that group that fought for the Nazis and then fought against the Soviets right after World War II. You can kind of see the symbol appeal. But of course, Putin's always going to be like, oh, it's all this Nazi propaganda, and maybe he's right. Maybe that there are some people in that unit that do believe in white supremacy or whatever you call it, right? I don't care. I mean, I think that unit did good. Honestly, they wanted to save the kulaks, and they never did, because, again, the kulaks just got massacred by Lenin and Stalin. We all know that socialism is bad. Okay. Again, read the Black Book of Communism. I'm not going to tell you what to do. But, again, the Nazis were just as terrible. They wanted to do everything just for one race. It was National Socialism, not International Socialism. Like, Soviet socialism was totally different. But, that's besides the point, right? Right after, what was it? So, once they got their land, so this was, 1970s, again, transfer of land to Crimea. Crimea was part of Ukraine. And then, Vladimir Putin came in power, I believe, around 2008. This was the second time he was president. And he decided to take over Georgia first. And it was kind of a warning sign to Ukraine. And Ukraine started electing pro-European leaders instead of pro-Russian leaders. And then, what happened was in 2014, they took over the Russian peninsula of Crimea. And then, Like, again, 2022, same thing happened. There were Russian speakers on the Ukrainian border, and they said they must liberate them. And actually, the year before, 2021, is when they stopped using Russian as an official language in Ukraine. So you could start to see that the shift of Ukrainian is starting to be more and more common in Ukraine. There used to be a mix between Russian and Ukrainian in their country. So a lot of people would say, "Oh, you sound like a Russian. But you're from Ukraine." Well, that's because Ukraine used to speak a lot more Russian. Nowadays, Ukrainians are actually learning Ukrainian as a second language, and they're actually starting to drop it and just start using Ukrainian more and more, just to seem like they're more pro-Ukrainian than Russian. So a lot of Ukrainians, even though their first language is Russian, they want to appeal more to their government or their military, and they want to seem like they want to preserve their culture. So while a lot of them did speak Russian, like especially President Zelensky, who was the president of Ukraine, he actually spoke Russian as his first language, and he's Jewish. So if Ukraine is a Nazi country, how come the president's a Jewish guy? But we're not going to talk about that again. I don't want to get too demonetized. But I just think that like the media spins it like, oh, Ukraine's so bad. Why does Ukraine get all this aid? And they're a white country, and all the other countries that are at war don't get all this aid. And I think the main reason is because the baby boomers hated Russia. I mean, when you think about it, look at all the old Americans, right? They still think they're in the Cold War. They still think, oh, socialism's going to take over. And they might be absolutely true. I agree with the old people that socialism is bad. But Russia is not something to be concerned about anymore. Russia has such a declining population. They have a lot of natural resources on their borders, and they're very big in terms of how much land area they have. But they're not really a big enough threat for me to say. And quarter of their nuclear weapons work. 3/4 of their nuclear weapons do not work. So really, the nuclear weapon supply is not even a big deal, really. They've lost a few nukes, and those can explode at any time. But really, Russia itself is not as big as a threat as they used to be during the Soviet times. And to be honest, I don't hate Russia, and I don't hate Ukraine. I want their countries to exist. If there was a way I could get the war to stop, and have Russia and Ukraine, preserve their cultures, and I don't know. If they want to keep Putin around, they can. But I just don't want people to die anymore. That's all I care about, right? In life, all I want is people not to suffer as much. Yes, suffering is an inevitable part of life, right? I do believe that. But the human mind's always for laziness. It's always for leisure. And if there was a way I could get Russians and Ukrainians to live as comfortably as Americans, oh, that would be such a better world, don't you think? That their dollar would, or their currency would mean this as much as our currency? That would be so much of a better world, right? We should be competing against Russia in terms of economics, not in terms of war. But that's exactly what we've done. We transferred all our economic material, just like in the book 1984, by the way, when Russia and the United Kingdom turned into two separate countries in order to destroy their supply, their economies, to keep their populations in poverty. They would go to war. That's exactly what's happening now with Ukraine and Russia. It's very sad, but that being said, right, I don't know who started this war. I mean, you could argue that taking away the Russian language in Ukraine, like legally speaking, has done absolutely terrible things for Ukraine. Ukraine sort of tried their best to preserve the Russian-speaking status in their schools and stuff like that. They had 16 official languages they were teaching in their schools, and then they took away Russian in their schools, even though, what was it, 30-40% of Ukrainians spoke Russian as a first language. That's not a very smart move on Ukraine's part. It makes Ukrainians seem like a higher status than Russian. And then, of course, the Russians were going to say, hey, you're oppressing Russian speakers. Like, of course, that makes it so much harder for Ukraine to justify their existence with. And the fact that they took Khmer in the 1970s and 1980s was a really bad move on their part. They should have never done that. And I think, actually, Lithuania would have been invaded into the Russian Federation if they would have taken the piece of, they would have taken Kaliningrad. They probably would be they probably would have been invaded today, honestly, or not today, but a few years ago. Lithuania has that piece of close to that Russian territory. If they would have taken that deal during the 1970s and 80s, they probably would not be an independent, very unified country today. So, While they do have a lot of Russian speakers in Lithuania, it's not as much as Ukraine, in my opinion. It's not as it wasn't as linguistically divided. Um, that being said, um, what is the future of Ukraine? What does it hold? Honestly, I'm gonna say like they're not gonna be able to take all that territory back. They can preserve about 3/5 of their territory. Right now, 1/5 is controlled by the Russians, and 4/5 is controlled by Ukraine. However, because Russia's in a better situation right now for the war, and because NATO hasn't stepped in, I would say they're going to lose another fifth of their territory, and then they're going to call for peace like Finland did during the continuation war after around World War II time when they did that. So it's going to be a lot like the continuation war against Finland with the Soviets. I think it's going to be a lot like that. The Russian Federation versus Ukraine. It's going to be a lot like that. Again, the Soviets and the Russian Federation, two separate countries technically. But you can argue because the Soviet Union was majority Russian, you can argue that it is kind of the before country of the Russian Federation. Again, I don't know exactly how to describe it. The whole situation is very weird. And again, 30 years ago, Russians and Ukrainians used to be the same nationality. Used to be Soviet, or 40 or I think it was 40 years ago at least. I mean, think about that for a second. You got brother and brother fighting each other. You know, these people who thought very similarly politically at one point are now fighting each other and are dying. Now, yes, 30 years of history has passed, and they're independent countries now. And I do think Ukraine has a right to exist. So I would like to see Ukraine exist in the future. Whether or not they are bad or good, I don't know. I'm not over there. I don't know who's bad or good. I don't know if the Russians are bad or good. I don't know if the Ukraine's bad or good. I don't have any side in this conflict. But I just wanted to talk about the history of Ukraine. I hope I didn't seem so arrogant as an American looking from the outside in. Again, us Americans, because of the baby boomer generation, or because of the older generations in the United States that hate Russia, we obviously have a bias towards Ukraine. But I think that bias is slowly going away. And I think, again, the main reason we're supporting Ukraine over other countries and other wars is because, again, we just hate the Russians. We just have a boner for the Russians. But that's besides the point. You are someone, I am someone else. Goodbye now.